guys, we want to cover the idea of the first resurrection consisting of three stages, just like a harvest. The resurrection is spoken of like a harvest. The harvest is the end of the world. And, in terms of the harvest, you have, which Israel would have been familiar with this in their harvesting, they would have been the first fruits, and there would have been the harvest, and then there would be the gleanings, which were the crops that were left over at the end of the harvest. And so there were phases of the harvest, if you will. And we see this in the resurrection as well, that Christ is called the firstfruits. Paul mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 23, he says that every man shall be made alive in Christ, every man in Christ shall be made alive, but every man in his own order. And he says, Christ the firstfruits, afterward they that are Christ at his coming, then cometh the end. So there's three stages there. Then cometh the end, that's the end of the tribulation, when the rest of the dead that are raised up to reign with Christ 1,000 years. And so the harvest consists of those three phases. Christ is the firstfruits, afterward they that are Christ is coming, that's the main harvest, which we would say that is the rapture of the church. And then afterward then cometh the end, and the end would be the end of the world, the end of Daniel's 70th week, when Israel's been reconciled. And so there's a lot going on in a harvest. And you'll miss these things if you think about it and approach it the way that the first century Jews did with regards to their Messiah coming. They're not thinking of Christ coming and then he's going to be crucified and then he's going to rise again and ascend up into glory. And then returning and reigning in Jerusalem on the throne of David. They didn't see it that way. They saw it as one coming. He shows up, he reigns over them, and they become, the leader of the world. And so they didn't see this in phases of events. And a lot of people, when they come to the second coming of Christ, they're approaching it the same way, a simplistic way, but there's more involved in it. And so, if you can imagine, when you read the Old Testament, the harvest even is another way of thinking about it. But in Israel, like in ancient times, when they spoke of the harvest, there were actually two harvests. There was the spring harvest, which is what the Jewish feast days of firstfruits and Pentecost. Firstfruits and Passover and Pentecost. That was in the first spring harvest, the barley and the wheat and those types of things. And then there was the summer harvest, which consisted of your olives and grapes and pomegranates, and that was at the end of their year in the 7th month. And that's when they had their Feast of Trumpets, and they had their atonement, and then they had their ingathering. It's called the ingathering, the Feast of Tabernacles. So this was at the end. And so even in the terms of the harvest, there were different stages of the harvest, different seasons of the harvest. And so this is what it's going to be like in the end of the world. And when it comes to Christ's return, it's not unusual to think of things in this way. If you think of an army that's going to attack a city, they may have a staging event. They may set the battle in array, and then they'll attack. Well, you may call the attack on the city one event, but it preceded by the preparation and some preliminary events, like the assembling together. And this is the way we look at the coming of Christ when he returns. He's coming first for the saints in the air, and then he's coming secondly with the saints to the earth. But in the harvest, there are a lot of diversity in the crops, if you will. There are the resurrected Old Testament saints. There's the rapture of the church. There is the ingathering at the end of the tribulation with the living Jews and the living saints, the sheep that are gathered together to the Lord when he gathers all nations together and separates the sheep from the goats. And among those, it mentions in Ezekiel 20, and we'll put all these verses in the description below, but he gathers them into the wilderness and he purges out the rebels from among them. And so there's some additional things that are going on where if they were all caught up to heaven to meet the Lord in the air, there wouldn't be any separating of the sheep and the goats. There wouldn't be any. It would be done in the rapture. There wouldn't be any purging out of the rebels from among them. It would be done in the rapture. And there'd also create this situation where we see that those that are resurrected and called to meet the Lord in the air are transformed, and there's neither married nor given in marriage in the resurrection. But we see in the end of the world, when the nations are gathered together, and the Jewish people that never died, they go on into the reign of Christ, they continue to marry and bear children. And so there's differences that are going on in these things, and we'll put some verses there for you to look at. But consider these things when you're studying through, and don't just assume that it all has to be this simplistic, simple one stage event and fall into the same error that the first century Jews did with the first coming of Christ. All right.